These are 3 disturbing stories coming from police officers and their families. If you have a true story, submit it to Chilling Nightmares. My brother Thomas joined the police force 5 years ago. He was 21 when he completed the Fayetteville Police Training Academy in North Carolina. He was idealistic and optimistic. It may sound mundane, but he genuinely wanted to make a difference and improve people's lives. He's a great guy with a good heart and caring nature. One day a call came to check a house. He knew the place outside of town and thought it had been abandoned for many years. Way before he had joined the police force. That should give you an idea of what condition the house was in. When he arrived, a man was sitting on the steps to the front door with his hands to his face leaning over. When he approached the man, he could see that he was crying. He knelt a short way in front of the man and identified himself as a police officer and asked what was the nature of the emergency. The man, between sobs, murmured something like how awful it is. He continued to question the man, but he was inconsolable and incoherent. He could see that the man was traumatized. He called for paramedics and backup so that he could enter the house. Another officer arrived on the scene, and Thomas drew his gun and entered the house. Not even past the threshold, he was assaulted by a grim odor. It was overpowering and rancid. He said it was nearly impossible to breathe. He had to push his way into the smell and the debris that filled the house. Every square inch of space was crammed with boxes, newspapers, and magazines. The kitchen was a disaster zone, with pots and pans stacked unwashed with rotten food. It was clearly evident that the occupant was a hoarder, but the filth was disgusting. Old takeout containers littered the floor, some still with rancid food. As training had taught him, Thomas shouted, "Police officer, is anyone here?" There was only silence, but experience told him to be cautious. He kept his gun ready as he moved from room to room. Only a small path to follow through the clutter. Even with 5 years on the force, his heart rate was up and building as he moved forward. He didn't encounter anyone in the first 2 rooms and crept down a hall where the smell was getting much more intense. He had to cover his mouth and nose to keep from vomiting. At the end of the hall was a door that he suspected was the door to the master bedroom of the house. He opened the door to a chilling nightmare. In the bed were 2 bodies. The corpses were in decomposition, crawling with maggots, and the room swarming with flies. For whatever reason, Thomas decided to investigate further, a decision he regretted. The first victim was male, about 30 years of age, and the second a female, about 27 or 28. The skin on their faces sagged and detached from the bone. Flies buzzed in and out of their mouths that gaped open. It was horrifying. It still gets more terrifying and dreadful. As my brother watched the flies landing on eyeballs and nostrils, he surveyed the victims. In the arms of the deceased woman, he was shocked to see the corpse of an infant child. When a mouse poked its head out of the child's mouth, Thomas stumbled and ran for the door. Outside, he vomited, and a paramedic gave him oxygen. As it turned out, the man on the steps was an associate of the deceased man. They worked together in Fayetteville, and when he hadn't shown up for work in several weeks, he went to the house to see what was up with him. He had been the first to come across the bodies. Very few people in town knew the family. They lived boarded up in that old house. The women never went out, and the man only worked where few people interacted with him. They were a family that fell through the cracks of the community. The coroner determined the cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning. There was no maintenance on an ancient heating system within the house. It took all 3 in their sleep. If there's any comfort in that they did not suffer. My brother has moved and is in a different town, but is still a police officer. After his gruesome findings at the house, he had some difficulties sleeping and had therapy to learn to cope with it. He says he still has nightmares about the child in his dead mother's arms, and he hears the baby crying. My mother is a patrol officer working with a partner, which is safer than working alone. But still, a patrol officer's job is perilous. You never know what you'll have to face when out on patrol. Every day is different. She counts on her training, experience, and partner to survive daily. She has been a patrol officer for over 5 years and has faced some difficult situations. Still, none have been as frightening as this story. For the most part, our town is quiet, and we consider it safe as far as cities go in our state. But don't let that fool you. Things still happen, and sometimes can escalate out of control quickly. One day, my mom got a call that there was a man with a gun barricaded in his home. The neighbor had called and said the man had been acting crazy for several days. He felt that his neighbor was hallucinating that he was back in the Persian Gulf, where he served in Desert Storm. She and her partner raced to the scene and parked their patrol car to block the road and keep a safe distance from the house. The houses on the road are somewhat spread, which reduced the risk of danger to the neighbors on either side. However, that neighborhood backed up to a newer development with an elementary school directly behind the house, and a daycare to the right of that. My mom and her partner spread out and approached the house to make contact with the delusional man inside. They hadn't taken many steps when the man opened fire in their direction. They ducked behind the patrol car, taking cover. Her partner grabbed the shotgun as she frantically radioed for backup. All my mother had was her Glock, which wasn't a great defense at this distance. Same for the shotgun her partner had. In minutes, more squad cars arrived on the scene, but before they were out of their vehicles, the man charged out of the house, firing like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. As he darted behind the house, he was blasting away to keep all the officers down. At that moment, the school bell rang. All the officers feared what was happening. The school doors burst open, and a throng of middle schoolers raced into the playground. The deranged ex-soldier also heard the school bell, and in a zigzag run with an AR-15, America's rifle, swept the ground ahead and traversed to the school, shooting off rounds at the police in pursuit. Officers moved from tree to tree and fence post to fence post, trying to get into a position to cut him off from the school. Then came the grim call over the radio, "Officer down, officer down." A dozen law enforcement officers acted, knowing they had to prevent the crazed shooter from entering the school grounds. Too many children were now playing tag, unaware of the danger just yards away. From the paramedics in the rear, the questions were flying. Who's hit? Are they alive? How many are down? Within minutes, I got a flood of text messages that my mother, the first on the scene, was shot. At the time, I was driving and had no knowledge of any gun battle happening across town. I pulled over to a gas station to read the messages and dig for more information. I was shaking and perspiring in terror that my mom was dead or dying in a police standoff with a maniac. Minutes later, I received a message that the threat had been eliminated. The gunman had been shot. Still, no one had any information on my mother's condition. I was terror-stricken. I was in tears that I had lost my mother. The worst-case scenarios played out in my head. She's bleeding out and dying on an ambulance stretcher. Just then, my phone buzzed, and through my dizzy, foggy, teary eyes, I read, "I don't know if you've heard yet, but there's been a gun battle near the elementary school. The perp is down and I'm fine. We did lose an officer though. I'll give you the details at home tonight. Love you, Mom." I was overjoyed and relieved beyond belief. My thoughts went to the officer that didn't make it. Someone in their family was going through this scenario with the dreadful news. My heart ached for them and pounded in relief for my mother. The story was told by my mother as she was first on the scene, and she and her partner attempted to pin the gunman down to prevent him from reaching the school before SWAT could arrive. The SWAT deputy rushed the gunman to protect the school children and took a fatal round from the AR-15. The quick response officer was rushed to the hospital. Still, too many minutes had passed before the threat was neutralized and the officer could be attended to by first responders. He was dead before they could get him into the ambulance. As a teenager, my mom was an airline attendant and was away from home many nights. Dad wasn't much of a cook, so he often took us kids out for dinner. I remember one night when it was just the two of us. My brother and sister were at their friends' homes, leaving just Dad and me to fend for ourselves. I was in the mood for pizza, and Dad thought that was a great idea and suggested the Village Pizza. It's my favorite pizza restaurant, so it's an easy yes. He had just completed his shift and said he was also starved. He was a narcotics officer for the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. He investigated narcotic-related crimes, including drug trafficking. He's a pretty tough guy, and my role model. Anyway, he and I went to the Village Pizza. We ordered our favorite mushroom and pepperoni for me, a Supreme for him, and a pitcher of root beer with 2 iced mugs. My dad is really great. We ate pizza, watched football on the big screen, and toasted with root beer. After 9, we paid the bill and headed out to the car. On our way home, we were recapping the game highlights as Monday night quarterbacks having a blast. We were halfway home when Dad said, "Hold that thought, son. Something's not right." He was looking in the rearview mirror, so I glanced over my shoulder to see the road behind him, asking him what was up. He said the black SUV had followed us since we left the restaurant. I could see a big SUV with its lights not far behind us. Dad said, "Let's see if they're really following us. Let's head over to the grocery." It required several turns to get there from where we were. He took the next turn, taking the shortcut to the store, which had several right-left turns to get there. I watched as the SUV followed us, not on our bump or anything, but not back very far. After 9 o'clock on the residential streets is pretty quiet, and there aren't a lot of cars on the roads. This car was clearly following us. Dad fished his cell phone from his pocket and made a call on speaker. The dispatch listened without a word to my father's fears about the car behind us. He told the dispatch, "I got my son with me." I was beginning to tremble, realizing the gravity of that call. We were still just haphazardly driving the streets. The dispatch said, "We're tracking you. Turn right into the industrial park 1/2 mile ahead. 3 patrol cars are coming in from the north and should arrive shortly after you enter the complex." Dad held his speed as normal so as not to tip off our pursuers that a trap had been laid. We turned into the industrial park, and the black SUV now directly on our bumper high beams followed. Moments later, the scream of sirens and flashing blue lights were all around us, and the SUV was pinned in. My dad jumped from the car with his service piece in hand that he always carries. There are a lot of shouts of hands where I can see them, and down on the ground. I could see 3, maybe 4 men in their mid-20s being handcuffed and being leaned against the cruiser. It took about an hour before the gang was taken off to the station, and Dad returned to the car. He explained that he and his team had taken down a ring of drug smugglers and had intercepted a large shipment of fentanyl being transported across the country. Some of the crime bosses lost a lot of money and were angry. This sometimes resulted in specific DEA officers being targeted in retribution. Dad continues to work for the DEA, but this night is still the most chilling nightmare for both of us. For him, because he had put me at risk. That thought haunts him every time we go out.